Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about expanding the definitions of architecture. On this week's episode, I am joined by Martha Thorne. Martha is currently the dean at the IE School of Architecture and Design in Madrid, and since 2005, she has been the executive director of the Pritzker Architectural Prize, a position that actually she'll be stepping down from next month. Before both of these roles, she was the Associate Curator of Architecture at the Art Institute of Chicago. This episode was recorded at the end of last year, at the end of 2020, and she hadn't announced yet that she'd be stepping down from her position at the Pritzker. So we spent a lot of time in this conversation talking about this role and the Pritzker Prize in general. We talk about working with the jury, how the prize has evolved over the last decade, and even the role or the value of awarding prizes like this in architecture every year. We also talk about how this role, which is actually a part-time position, intersects and influences her job as dean, working with, in many ways, the next generation of architects, and how those two positions sort of intersect and diverge from each other. In both of these positions, though, she's sort of forced to deal with the expanding and blurry definitions of architecture today. So it was fascinating to hear how she thinks about the state of architecture and where it might be going. Remember that Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you. Through 2021, we'll be releasing new episodes every single week. So if you enjoy this show and want to help support it and want to see it continue, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Episodes will always be free, but members get an exclusive monthly newsletter written by me, previews of the upcoming episodes, and all sorts of other kind of bonus content. This show in so many ways is made possible because of this support. So if you want to be a part of that, you can visit scratchingthesurface.fm. Thank you as always for listening, and here is my conversation with Martha Thorne. There's so much that I want to talk to you about, and I feel like there's so much kind of different areas that we could discuss. But I think to help frame the conversation, I'd like to talk a little bit about your background and how you got into the career that you've had. And so you studied, your bachelor's was in something called urban affairs that you did from State University in Buffalo, right?
Right, that's correct.
And then you got a master's in city planning. You spent some time in London School of Economics. It seems to me that you kind of got into the architecture world through thinking about the city first and then kind of went into architecture. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what you were interested in when you were in school, and what kind of career you were after, or what was kind of interesting to you at the time?
Yeah, no, it takes me back a few
Yeah.
decades, but I think I think there may be some lessons to learn from my experience. At least I would hope so. When I went to college, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to study. And I think back then is somehow similar to now, that where young people are very idealistic. They want to make a contribution. They want to change the world. And I think my first thought was more in the field of psychology or social work. And I realized that I was too impatient to deal with the world one person at a time.
Right.
And I think that therefore the opportunity to look at cities, to look at communities, was something that intrigued me. I realized that there were many facets, so therefore you didn't have to choose one. You could look at a phenomenon from different points of view. So that's how I became first interested in cities. Of course, I lived in cities not as big as New York, smaller cities, but was always in the city, and so you could use your hometown as well as a resource. I think going to London to look at town and country planning, especially living in London, was a great opportunity to see the relationship between planning, between city form, and a city that had developed over history the way London had. So those were probably the reasons I became involved in cities. But after I finished graduate school, I moved to Spain, And that was for personal reasons. You know how Americans are always trying to find themselves.
Yeah.
So I moved to Spain and, of course, wanted to work, wanted to be involved in the profession, and realized that in a country like Spain, city planning is not a recognized degree. It's undertaken either by architects or by civil engineers.
Mm.
And I happened to move in the crowd of architects, so became much more involved with architects. And although I did work on a project for a historic city, an inventory of a historic city in Spain, I worked on a project for a university master plan. After that, the opportunities that came my way were more related to publishing
Mm.
architectural magazines or working with people who were writing and communicating architecture. So I would say I sort of got into architecture through the side door, but I do think that this is probably a tendency, maybe more for women than men. And I think it's more of the 21st century than maybe many, many decades ago. I think we're realizing that we need to be much more flexible. We can't always predict what the future will hold. And I also think our understanding of profession is changing. It's not the idea that you will have a job, the same job for 30 years, but you may want to change, try something 5 years. There's a shift in the context in your life, then do something else. So that's basically my story, how I became much more closely involved with architecture and communicating and trying to understand architecture in the built environment.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me, and you confirmed a little bit of my theory of you, actually, in that our obviously we grew up in different times in different parts of the country. I'm in graphic design. You were kind of circling architecture, but my education experience and career was a kind of constantly expanding idea where I started with this like idea of the designed object, and then I was interested in the systems, and then I was interested in like, well, how does this affect people and how does this affect the world? And it seems to me that you almost were a little bit opposite. You were actually interested in the workings of the city, of the people in the city before you started thinking about the buildings themselves. And you talked about kind of the split between the civil engineers and the architects. Do you have a sense, looking back now, what it was about kind of veering towards the architecture side? What was it about buildings that kind of captured you?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably a few things. If we go from the general to the specific, I would say the general is that arguments about people, arguments about experience, arguments or discussions about a city in terms of governance, those are very sterile unless they're connected to a physical environment. We can't talk about urban policies unless we talk about investment in buildings and infrastructure, roads, energy, etc. And so I think that one thing is understanding that behavior, aspirations, all of the things that contribute to a city in terms of its vibrancy, that happens within a physical environment, and to make the connection is probably a good idea. And then and then the second thing I would say that got me more and more interested in architecture was understanding the process that architects follow and trying to understand that something beyond just the functional aspect of a building. So what can the building do to inspire people to become part of the collective memory? What are the challenges that architects are facing as they're designing buildings and as they're thinking about not only the building maybe as object or the building individually, but thinking about the context. So I think that that second aspect was something that through my contacts and through my work and experience, I grew to appreciate. And now I think you can see that I'm enormously devoted to architecture, the opportunities, the contributions it can make, and also communicating not just to the general public through exhibitions, but to communicating to students, maybe to developers, to people who work in the built environment, and trying to find common ground for that appreciation of architecture.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that specifically kind of in the work that you're doing now, both as dean at IU University of Madrid and also with the Pritzker Prize. But you said something interesting in there and in your previous answer that I'm curious about, that very early on you found yourself kind of getting pulled into publishing and writing and things like that, and you were the curator of architecture at the Art Institute of Chicago for almost 10 years. Did you have, so this is a two-part question, and one of these is an easy answer. I just couldn't find it in my research. um, did you did you work as an architect first, and then two, did you have an interest in actually being a designer, or was it always about the kind of ideas of what the buildings can do? You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah. I would say it's always about the ideas
Yeah,
because
yeah.
no, I didn't train as an architect. I probably can't draw a straight line. I can read plans. I definitely can read plans. I can interpret buildings. I love to visit cities, visit buildings, go to museums, try to analyze the physical space, the activities, and all of
Hmm.
that. But no, I never worked as an architect. Um, and it's funny because a lot of people who say, "Oh, I'm a frustrated architect," I'm not, because I think
Yeah.
I have the best of many worlds. I did work at the office of Juan Navarro Baldeweg,
Mm,
and supported him in, especially when he was undertaking a project for Princeton University.
okay.
But it was always from the sidelines, so to speak, or from
Yeah.
the periphery of what the actual design process is. But again, I think that if we look at architecture as a profession, I think it's evolving. Not everyone is an architectural designer. There are so many roles and so many fields and so many aspects to the profession that are super important. So I think that communicating for me was one, and I never felt frustrated not to practice architecture. I always
Yeah.
felt really lucky to be there close to people who are practicing.
Right. And you still got that by being close, you still got to be a part of that process in a way, which is kind of what you were talking about, kind of helping you understand that. And that's exactly why I kind of asked you that question, because I feel like design generally, but I think this applies to architecture also, is that there is an increasing awareness that the practice or the profession is not just about buildings. It isn't just about these objects, that there is this kind of larger discourse around it now, which in a weird way is kind of what you've been a part of your whole career, right?
Yeah. I think so, and I think if we look at the profession of architecture, and it depends, it's different in different countries and in different
Mm,
contexts. I think there is a lot of tension within the profession, or maybe redefinition, or
yeah.
trying to come to grips with what is exactly the role of an architect.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's one answer. I think there are probably multiple answers. But I think we have to be able to discuss and value and appreciate those multiple answers. And especially if we look at our cities, how many buildings are built by builders, developers? How many buildings are undertaken by architects? What do we feel about the cities and our built environment? What is memorable? What is important to
Hmm.
us? and there's not one set rule. But I think all of those things indicate that we have to broaden our understanding and our appreciation of the many roles of architects in the city today.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I agree 100%. And you've set up basically everything that I want to talk to you about in that answer. Let's kind of talk about that in relationship to your role with the Pritzker Prize, where you're the executive director,
Mhm.
and you have been since 2005. And I'm before we do that, can you just for people that maybe don't know, and even I'm a little bit unclear, can you talk about what it means to be the executive director? You don't actually sit on the jury, but what is your role there? How do you kind of sit between the family and the jurors and the architectural profession? What do you kind of how do you
Right.
kind of see that job?
Yeah, no, I'm in the best position if
Yeah,
you ask
yeah.
me. My role is I do several things for the prize. One, perhaps, is the stability because jury members have a tenure of minimum 3 years. But of
Mm,
course, I've been there longer, so that respecting the processes and sort of keeping the stability of the prize is something that the executive director does. Mostly from
mm,
behind the scenes, because you're right. I'm not a member of the jury. I don't vote. I don't have a voice or a vote with the jury, but my role is to assist them in any way that I can and that they need. So assisting the jury is, for example, the jury when COVID is not around, we travel together
mm,
for about a week a year to visit buildings in a specific context in a place. And so I help plan that trip, or I plan that
mm,
trip for them based on where they would like to go. I prepare the documentation for any meetings that they have. And then the other main part that I deal with that does help the jury is the nominations process. The
mm,
nominations for the Pritzker Prize are open to any licensed architect, but in addition to that, to receiving unsolicited nominations, I also send out about 200 emails every year and invite people from around the world, journalists, bloggers, professors, architects, museum directors, people who have a love and an interest in architecture. I invite them to send me the name or names that they would like to suggest for next year. And that is something, it's very interesting, um, because I gather those names, I do research about the ones especially that are not well known, and I share those names and information with the jury. I never share the source of the suggestion or the source of the nomination, and I never tell them how many people suggested this person or that
uh,
person. So the jury gets a long list to know what the public is thinking, and they then try to come to grips. And of course, the jury is the independent jury makes the decision about the winner. And I think it's really interesting because the Pritzker Prize, we often say it's like the Nobel Prize of Architecture. And
yeah.
in some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. But it is for a person or people who work together. So it's in that sense, it's like the Nobel. It goes to individuals
Hmm.
who embody excellence through the art of architecture and service to humanity. So,
Mm,
in that sense, it's very interesting to listen to the discussions of the jury as they talk about excellence, as they talk about what is the art of architecture, and as they discuss what is service to humanity. So, those are the things I do. Plus, the best thing is I get to call the winner or winners and tell them that they won, which
oh,
is
nice.
which is really wonderful. And of course, I represent the prize when need be, and symposia or other places. I try to answer questions that come to me through email of all types. I try to do that.
Hmm.
And so that's basically what an executive director does.
I mean, so how do you, it's interesting to hear kind of how you sort through the nominations, and that you reach out to people and kind of ask for nominations, and then prepare that for the jury. And I'm kind of curious how you think about what we were just talking about this kind of expanding definition of architecture, this how there are different ways to think about architecture, how in different parts of the world architecture is thought of differently. How do you apply that to something like the Pritzker Prize, where it is one person every year, and how do you kind of, I don't know how to frame this question in the way I'm trying to say like, this is the person who's representative, who's deserving of the prize, but also this is just one
Hmm.
person. You know what I mean? Like, how do you kind of think about that in collecting the nominations, and then even when the jury's selecting?
Yeah, it's well, in that sense, I have to say, frankly, the jury has the difficult task there, because they're the ones who have to distill the arguments to create a meaningful message each year. And I think if we look back at winners of the Pritzker Prize, we can see that the message has different nuances, and it's not the exact same message every year, especially in these past 10 years. If we went back to the very beginning of the prize, back in 79, early 80s, and if we were to read the jury citations, probably back then they would be more similar. They talked about creativity, talent, maybe dedication, maybe innovation, sort of broad qualities to describe the person who won the prize that year. I think now, if we look at the jury citations, the jury is talking about not only about the individuals and their wonderful human qualities or professional qualities, but they're also talking about that service to humanity, or how does this architect fit within the bigger picture? What is the message that we want to communicate? So for me, of course, I do this exercise individually, not with the jury. And I do see that the context in which we practice, or in which architects practice, does play a role. If we look back, there was a time when starchitects, or people who were making icons, were the ones who were top of mind. Then, with the recession in 2008, 9, and the subsequent years, I think that made us all shift to think about architecture in a different way. And therefore, perhaps the prize reflected this understanding of a changing world. It's hard to tell exactly where the prize will go, because,
Yeah.
again, the jury changes slightly. They're very independent thinkers. And I always, I sort of go into the meeting thinking, well, I have an idea for this year. I
Yeah.
don't think I think maybe once or twice I've gotten it right in all these
Oh,
years.
wow.
Yeah, it's a very, very exciting, intense, incredible opportunity to be that fly on the wall, listening to the jury
Yeah.
members discuss.
I mean, so I have two questions kind of
Mhm.
around that. And one is, you said kind of the criteria for the prize is the art of architecture, and then also the contribution or service to humanity. And I'm curious if you see those as separate things, and this goes back to what you're talking about with the Starchitect, where it's like, if you are designing this building that's like this gorgeous object, but then, had unfair labor conditions or was harmful to the environment, is that then still, like, even though maybe structurally it's beautiful, or is a breakthrough in architectural engineering or something, can we still say that that is a good building if it is somehow harmful to humanity? Like, how do those come together, and where do they separate, I guess, is the question I'm trying to ask.
I certainly can't speak for the Pritzker jury.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I can only speak for myself
yeah,
in
yeah, that's what I'm, yeah.
this. Yeah. I think what we're faced with is it cannot be an either or
Right,
situation.
right.
Um, the great challenge of architecture is to find the intersection of both of those.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, on one hand, as I mentioned before, it's not enough that a building just be functional, just work really well, or be super sustainable and ugly, or something like that, or 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 not be able to last. If it's something that's beautiful the first day and that's it. So I think that, on one hand, we have the discipline of architecture where architects have to contribute to the discipline, to that
Mm,
core knowledge. They have to somehow um, honor the history of the discipline and also try to push it forward. But at the same time, they have to be responsive to the world in which we live.
right.
And I think that never in our history has the profession had such pressure um, as we have now. And it's been crystallized in something like COVID. I mean, where there's been pressure on the profession in the past, we could see certainly global warming, rapid urbanization, technology, migration. Um, Human and man made disasters, things like that we've seen. But now with COVID, it sort of has come home to each and every one of us how we are connected. And we're connected not only through our behaviors, but we're also connected through our built environment and how we use our built environment. So I'm someone who thinks that the service to humanity is becoming, it's always been important, but it's becoming increasingly important to understand, to ponder, to measure. And it calls for enormous responsibility on the part of each and every professional. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
it has to be both. But you can't just, if I can tell you an anecdote I remember,
Yeah.
Shigeru Ban,
Mm,
who of course won the Pritzker, and we were fortunate here in Madrid. He built a paper tube temporary pavilion for my university, and he was giving a lecture, and there was question and answer for the students afterwards. And one student said, Architect Bond, I want to serve people. I want to help people. I want to make a contribution like you do. How can I be a good social architect? And he said, be the best architect you can first.
mm, mm.
Then you will find the way to help people. So I think that's sort of the message. We can't have a goal of we can't have a goal devoid of the discipline of architecture just
Right.
to help people. On the other hand, I personally don't think we can have a goal just of the discipline or just the artistic side of architecture or just the cultural side. It's much more than that.
I think you're right that there has been a shift in the prize over the last maybe decade at this point, away from the idea of the starchitect, of kind of the icon, and that has been controversial, obviously, to some. I don't think we need to talk about. I think you've talked about that enough. But I'm interested in how you think about the act of awarding a prize, how you can subvert this idea of that this person should become a starchitect or is a starchitect, or that this is some sort of hero worship. How do you kind of make the prize just as much about the person, as much as the person's ideas and work? How do you kind of find that balance?
Yeah, Jared, that's a really hard question, and I don't think I found the balance, but let me take a stab.
Okay. Okay.
Um, I I think that it is a good idea to reward people. I think that
Mm,
we don't have to look just at an invention, just at an
mhm, mhm,
idea. I think we can recognize human values. When I think of last year's or this year's Pritzker laureates, the 2020, when I think of the 2020 Pritzker laureates, Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara,
mhm,
um, not only do I think of their ideas about architecture, but I like to celebrate the fact that the way they practice is very collaborative. I like to celebrate the fact that they are very generous with their colleagues, they're generous with
mhm.
the community. There are a lot of things about them as individuals that I think we should be applauding just as much as the buildings that they build or the communities that they contribute to. So I think there is human talent. There is very unique aspects to each architect's approach, and why not celebrate that?
Yeah.
On the other hand, the idea, and it is true that sometimes we have this idea that the person who becomes a celebrity then is a brand, and we stay in the surface of what that person can do or can contribute. I would say sometimes that's okay. If we want to call attention to a place, if we want to call attention to a cause, sometimes we do need celebrities because they sort of get us to look at something or open our minds to something. The problem is when it stays there and it doesn't go deeper. I think architecture is not an easy field. Design is not an easy field to explain to people all the efforts that go into creating a building, a design, whether it's graphic design, a website, or whatever. I think it's kind of hard to explain that. But so I would say I think we should recognize people, creativity, human effort. It can be role models for other people. It gives people encouragement and power to be even more effective in their
Mhm.
communities. But it cannot just stay at that superficial level or at a superficial level. We have to get into the message. What are they doing and how are they doing it?
That makes a lot of sense. And just to be honest, I was asking that question very selfishly, and I didn't mean to make it sound like it was either or. But I think about that. I am in no way comparing this little podcast to the Pritzker Prize, but this is a series of long form conversations with single people, and I think about that all the time. Of the episodes that are the best begin with the person and they talk about that person, but they expand into some larger idea. And that's always kind of what I'm after. And I feel like that's, the kind of Pritzker Prize model also. And I was kind of curious how you think about it. I think what you said makes a lot of sense.
No, I was just going to say, I think the other thing, and you maybe feel this in the podcast, um, when you're dealing with a subject that, although on one hand it touches the lives of many people, but on the other hand, it's not something that enters into their daily conversations. The question then becomes, well, how do I get there? And how can I engage them in the conversation? Because I think in the end, that's probably what we all want. It's much more interesting for me when I think about buildings and places that are created with somehow public participation, not just because it's the right thing or it's the democratic thing, but it also means that when people embrace their physical environment, when they love it, that's when
Mm-hmm.
they take care of it. That's when they
Mm-hmm.
appreciate it. That's when it becomes something beyond just the functional building. That's what creates community. And again, I think because of COVID, this idea for coming together and feeling part of a community has, at least for me, has become more and more important than ever.
Yeah. And that's actually a really nice way to transition into your other job, which I guess we should say that the Pritzker Prize is really just a part-time,
Right,
or like,
right,
kind of a part-time role. Your main job is Dean of the Architecture Program at IU University in
right,
Madrid.
right.
And I'm curious how these two roles intersect for you and how they influence each other. I imagine, um, in a way you're kind of working with jurors who are often kind of the top of the field,
Yep.
talking about architects who are the top of the field or really kind of thinking about this, and then also working with students who are thinking about maybe similar questions at the beginning of their career. How do you see the influence kind of shifting between each of these?
Yeah, it's really interesting because you're right. The Pritzker position is only a part time. I say that's
Yeah.
my nights and weekends role,
Yeah. Yeah.
and my main responsibilities are with the School of Architecture and Design here at IE. And we're a young school. We're 12 years old, but I'm very proud of the trajectory that it's had and where we
Mm.
are now and where we're going. I think if I look at how does the Pritzker play into IE and vice versa, it is kind of a symbiotic relationship. I am able to look at what's going on in the world through the lens of some of the Pritzker jurors, through the nominations process. So that naturally keeps me in tune what's going on internationally. IE is an international school, so we have students from all over the world. And I think by realizing the broad scope of architecture, how it's approached in different places, how the contexts are different, the challenges, the problems are different. I think that symbiosis between Pritzker and school is it's very direct and really good. I would say probably in other ways. Um, it's interesting in terms of the debates that the jury
Mm.
has, on one hand,
Mm.
about what they see as the role of architecture. And when they're talking about potential winners of the prize, it's also this: what is the role of architecture in the world? What is the role of education?
Mm-hmm.
And those things are also they're very important to me, and I'm I don't want to say struggle with those questions, but
Yeah.
maybe I do struggle because there's no clear answer,
Right.
and and it is it's I think it's a big responsibility, just as the jury has to make a good choice that will be seen within the body of the Pritzker laureates as of that quality, of that level of esteem. In education, we're trying to impart and create knowledge for students today, but will also be relevant longer
Right.
term. And so maybe that's a similarity between the prize and education. I have to say that I love being in the academic world. I find it fascinating to listen to students, what their concerns are. It's so stimulating to be in touch with the faculty members, their different areas of research and teaching. And I don't teach very much. I do team teach,
Mm.
and I teach a course with a colleague called "You Are the Mayor," and
Okay.
we teach to mostly non-architecture design students. We teach to students
Oh.
from the other four schools. So in that sense, I'm able to um, expand to this more transdisciplinary
Mm-hmm.
space
Mm-hmm.
with other students. So
Well, I mean, now I feel like I'm just going to ask you all the questions that I asked you about the Pritzker Prize for being in academia, which I won't. I promise I won't do that. But how do you think about that kind of transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, this kind of expanding
yeah.
definition, multiple definitions of architecture? And even, I mean, honestly, we could even kind of bring this back to that intersection of service to humanity and the
Mhm.
art or act of architecture itself. How does that manifest itself in the school? How do you think about teaching students? And I don't mean like you personally teaching
Yeah.
students, but the program teaching students like what they need to know to be a practicing architect, plus all that other
All
stuff.
that other
How does that happen?
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is a very interesting question, and I think that it's something that many schools of architecture and design are thinking about. When I look at the training for architects or designers, I think one of the greatest things that they have is the rigor of the design process. So this idea of research, of formulating hard questions, of researching more, reformulating, and then imagining, then taking a step forward and imagining and correcting, and this iterative process of back and forth, back and forth. I think that's a huge strength. And if we look at other professions, it's really quite unique to architecture and design. It's not,
Yeah.
it's if we look at medicine or we look at law or we look at economics, there are other pedagogical methods, there are other types of training which are quite different from architecture and design. So I think our field is very fortunate because it has a pedagogical method that is very much relevant for today, but also for these expanding circles of other disciplines. Now, that said, I don't want to say that, architecture is everything, design is everything. We also need the depth and the rigor that has always characterized the field of architecture or design, which is you have to know an approach, you have to develop an approach over years. There's lifelong learning, of course, in
Mm,
our
mm-hmm,
field.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, but you also have to know skills, you have to know techniques, and a lot of those things. So, um, in that sense, I believe we have to find a balance between the deep understanding that comes with disciplinary studies, and of course, we're all subject to accreditation processes and things like that. But then again, when we look at the world today, more than ever, a transdisciplinary approach is not simply a collage or an amalgamation of subjects, but it is knowing how they interrelate. And this is where I think things are going. Just in general, and we can look at different phenomena in society about this, you know. And maybe this is an example, maybe this is too much, but if we look at, for example, Sidewalk Labs, a sister company of Google, which began by becoming interested in presenting a proposal in Toronto. Well, is Google a technology company? Are they a city company? What? So there's a blurring there. I mean, that's an
Hmm.
example. Maybe it's
Yeah.
a little bit too direct, but it's an example of that. I think we see it in our daily lives. We can't say, for example, sustainability is related only to the built environment. Of course not. It's related to economics, it's related to social life, it's related to technology, it's related to many things. So to
Right.
try to put things back in boxes or silos doesn't seem to respond to reality, and it doesn't seem to be a way that's particularly relevant for the future. So, in
Hmm.
that sense, I think, at IE, we try to foster the um, academic excellence within our field, but then either through workshops, through how we approach project based learning, through different studies that we do. In the course I teach, You Are the Mayor, absolutely transdisciplinary.
Hmm.
Lots of group work where people in the teams have to understand the vocabulary of their colleague students and develop a common project together. So I'm really quite a defender of this cross pollination, and I hope and I believe that it will then allow students to transform themselves over the lives of their careers. I would be remiss if I said, "Oh, my job is so the students have a position at a company tomorrow, and
Hmm.
in 10
Right.
years down the road, we're obsolete." No, that's
Yeah.
we have to think about the short, medium, and long term, and hopefully awaken curiosity and that
Yeah.
desire for lifelong learning.
I have just a few questions to wrap up the conversation. I want to go back to the very beginning to something that you said when you were talking about, kind of falling into architecture and then into kind of publishing and content, and talked about kind of like women in the
Mhm.
field of architecture. And I want to know your thoughts on women in architecture, and specifically something I've been thinking about. And as I was thinking about the Pritzker Prize, and I know that that's um, the disproportionate amount of men who have won that than women, and the amount of women who are kind of running architecture studios and architecture firms. And it's the same thing in graphic design, where there was a study maybe last year or so that was about how many creative directors in graphic design and advertising agencies were men. And that was, it was like 80-90%, something like that. And something that's interesting to me, and I suspect this is similar in architecture, is most of my students are women,
Mhm.
and they are looking at a field where the top people in the field are more often than not men.
Mhm.
But what's interesting is the people leading the schools, leading the institutions, are also women. And so I'm curious. I think about, like, all the architects, the amount of men run architecture studios. But then you have I mean, yourself
Mhm.
as dean at
Mhm.
IE, you have Sarah Whiting at Harvard, you have Deborah Burke at Yale, you have Mel Andros at Columbia. What what's that disconnect? Like, why? What do you have thoughts on that? I don't know if I have a
Yeah,
more intelligent
yeah,
question than that, but that strikes me as something kind of fundamentally, something is not lining up there for some reason.
right. I think you have to look at when women became deans of institutions, academic institutions. It's relatively recently.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think Sarah Whiting is the first female dean in the history
Yeah.
of Harvard.
Yeah. Yeah.
And So I think that the profession of architecture and maybe design, I haven't looked so closely at the design because it's a much broader field in some ways, but it has traditionally, it has a history of being male dominated. Yes, we do have more women students in most all of the programs at my school, um, with the exception of real estate development. We have a master's, which is real estate development, based on the concept that developers today are city makers. And so, to understand the
Mm,
broader context, the value of city infrastructure, policies, architecture, etc. There we have 50% of the faculty are women, but only about
mm.
20% of the students are women. So,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, so when I look at these things, I think speaking specifically about the field of architecture, it has a lot to do, on one hand, with the history. It has to do with the structures that are still in place
Yeah,
at,
yeah.
at offices, at academic institutions. It's hard to break those structures. We need to raise consciousness on the part of people so they don't feel threatened by changing behaviors. They feel that
Hmm.
it's something very positive. But I think the big thing, and this is a very personal opinion, the big thing in the field of architecture and related industries is who controls the money. And where money is controlled by banks, by funds, by developers, there still is in these sectors or these industries a barrier to women. There's a lot of the old boys club about how
Yeah, yeah.
decisions are made. There's an emphasis on a feeling of trusting people who are like you,
Right.
and so it's not as seen as objective as other fields. So I think that said, women still have a long way to go. I think we have to do a lot to not only support women in education. I'm constantly reminding people that equality comes from big steps, but also from little steps.
Mm,
And those little steps can be something like just checking the bibliographies that you're using in a course. How many women authors are there? It can be when someone wants to invite a guest lecturer or a special someone to give a special class, and it's saying, well, let's invite a woman or equal numbers of women and men. I
mhm.
hear a lot of people say, whether it's in academia or in private industry, well, I'd invite a woman, but there aren't any. And and the problem then becomes, it's there are women, there are incredibly talented women, but many people don't know them. So when that happens, I think what we have to do is, women in the field, in academia and industry, we have to raise our voices and promote other women. We have to make databases where people who say, "Oh, I don't know any women," go to this place. Here's a lot. And I think that it's interesting because I also believe that women have a different way of communicating than men do. I have no qualms about writing to female colleagues from around the world, people I've never met, um, and having the confidence that they'll answer me. I have many people write to me or call me, women with sharing an article, asking a question. And we do this in a different way, maybe
Mm,
than maybe we don't go to the golf course or the tennis. So I
Yeah.
think, I don't want to say it's a question of time, because it's more than just a question of time. We have a lot of work to do,
Hmm.
within our professions, within our institutions. But I think we have to really look at the industries surrounding them, and require them to change. Require them to change. Women need to be on the boards of directors of companies, not just the token. They need to be
Right.
there in full force. And only when that happens, will we be able to see women represented in the percentage that they deserve in the in positions of responsibility, in architectural firms, in other places.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're exactly right. And I think for me, and it's the same in graphic design too, that the directors of many of the big graphic design programs in the United States are women. And seeing that in architecture and the amount, of students makes me feel like, I think the way you said it, it's like there's the big steps and the small steps feel like, we're
Mhm.
on those steps in some way. My last question, and this is the question that I use to end all of these conversations. I'd love to know what you're reading right now.
Oh, yeah. I can't remember the title of the. I'm reading a novel, which is it's set in early 20th century. Oh goodness, I'll have to send you the name of it, Jarrett,
Okay.
because I
Okay.
I, I can't I can't remember the name of it. This is terrible. And it is it's sort of it's a story, and it's a reflection on different characters and how their lives transpired based on previous events. And they
Mm.
seemed like sort of a random event. Somebody fell down the stairs and broke a leg, and so then the daughter had to care for the mother, and so that meant that she couldn't go on a trip, and that meant something
Oh, I
else.
see.
So it's really interesting to me. I mean, it's something that I'm enjoying very much, because on one hand, it reminds me that we have choice, we have
Hmm.
influence, we have agency in our own lives. But then it's not 100% that way. We also are being pushed and pulled
Yeah.
by the situations around us, and I guess maybe this is more poignant for me now, because I feel very pushed and pulled by COVID.
Yeah. 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 As we all do.
Oh goodness! But I think, yeah, to escape in a novel, which is something that I'm usually reading, books about the city or architecture or
Yeah.
designing sustainable things, or. But no, I'm really enjoying. I'm enjoying escaping to a novel, which is in some way it's a luxury to pause, because I think day to day life now for all of us is not the easiest time, whether we realize it or not. It is a much more stressful time than we had anticipated having. So, but I will send you the name and the author. Oh goodness, now I'm embarrassed that I can't remember.
Oh no, it's okay. You are definitely not the first person who has done that. So send it to me and we'll put a link on in the show notes so people can get to it. It sounds interesting. And I am with you. I've read over the last couple of years, my reading habits have shifted to much more fiction.
Mhm.
Um and this year especially, it's almost impossible for me to read something out. Like I just kind of need that fiction as an escape. So I think you I agree with you. I know exactly what you're talking about. Uh Martha, this was such a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed this and really appreciate how you think about what are really kind of complex issues facing architecture and design today. And I think really appreciate your really kind of nuanced and thoughtful kind of approach to it. So thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, Jarrett, it's been a pleasure. You had great questions, and I applaud the work that you're doing to help people share ideas and encourage others to enter the conversation. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. This episode was recorded on October 26, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.